country in Central Europe. Spanning in the Carpathian Basin, it borders Slovakia to the north, Ukraine to the northeast, Romania to the east and southeast, Serbia to the south, Croatia and Slovenia to the southwest, and Austria to the west. With about 10 million inhabitants, Hungary is a medium-sized member state of the European Union. The official language is Hungarian, which is the most widely spoken Uralic language in the world, and among the few non-Indo-European languages to be widely spoken in Europe. Hungary's capital and largest city is Budapest. Other major urban areas include Debrecen, Szeged, Miskolc, Pécs, and Győr. The territory of present Hungary was for centuries inhabited by a succession of peoples, including Celts, Romans, Germanic tribes, Huns, West Slavs and the Avars. The foundations of the Hungarian state were established in the late 9th century by the Hungarian Grand Prince Arpad following the conquest of the Carpathian Basin. His great-grandson Stephen I ascended the throne in 1000, converting his realm to a Christian kingdom. By the 12th century, Hungary became a regional power, reaching its cultural and political height in the 15th century. Following the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, Hungary was partially occupied by the Ottoman Empire 1541 to 1699. It came under Habsburg rule at the turn of the 18th century, and later joined Austria to form the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a major European power. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed after World War I, and the subsequent Treaty of Trianon established Hungary's current borders, resulting in the loss of 71% of its territory, 58% of its population, and 32% of ethnic Hungarians. Following the tumultuous interwar period, Hungary joined the Axis powers in World War II, suffering significant damage and casualties. Post-war Hungary became a satellite state of the Soviet Union, which contributed to the establishment of a socialist republic spanning 4 decades 1949 to 1989. Following its failed 1956 revolution against the Soviet-backed government, Hungary became a comparatively freer, though still repressive, member of the Eastern Bloc. Its seminal opening of its previously restricted border with Austria in 1989 accelerated the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, and subsequently the Soviet Union. On the 23rd of October 1989, Hungary became a democratic parliamentary republic. Hungary is an OECD high-income economy, and has the world's 54th largest economy by nominal GDP, and the 53rd largest by PPP. It ranks 45th on the Human Development Index, due in large part to its social security system, universal health care, and tuition-free secondary education. Hungary's rich cultural history includes significant contributions to the arts, music, literature, sports, science and technology. It is the 13th most popular tourist destination in Europe, drawing 15.8 million international tourists in 2017, owing to attractions such as the largest thermal water cave system in the world, second largest thermal lake, the largest lake in Central Europe and the largest natural grasslands in Europe. Hungary's cultural, historical, and academic prominence classify it as a middle power in global affairs. Hungary joined the European Union in 2004 and has been part of the Schengen area since 2007. It is a member of numerous international organizations, including the United Nations, NATO, WTO, World Bank, IIB, the AIIB, the Council of Europe, and the Visegrad Group. Group. The H in the name of Hungary and Latin Hungaria is most likely due to founded historical associations with the Huns, who had settled Hungary prior to the Avars. The rest of the word comes from the Latinized form of Byzantine Greek Aungro. The Greek name was borrowed from Old Bulgarian Agrinu, in turn borrowed from Oghur Turkic Onogur 10, tribes of the Oghurs. Onogur was the collective name for the tribes who later joined the Bulgar tribal confederacy that ruled the eastern parts of Hungary after the Avars. The Hungarian endonym is Magyarország, composed of Magyar Hungarian and Ország country. The name Magyar, which refers to the people of the country, more accurately reflects the name of the country in some other languages such as Turkish, Persian and other languages as Magyaristan or Land of Magyars or similar. The word Magyar is taken from the name of one of the 7 major semi-nomadic Hungarian tribes, Magyari. The first element Magi is likely from Proto-Ugric man, person, also found in the name of the Mansi people Mansi, mans. The second element Deri, man, men, lineage, survives in Hungarian Ferge husband, and is cognate with Mari Urge son, Finnish archaic young man. The Roman Empire conquered the territory west of the Danube River between 35 and 9 BC. From 9 BC to the end of the 4th century AD, Pannonia, the western part of the Carpathian Basin, was part of the Roman Empire. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD under the stress of the migration of Germanic tribes and Carpathian pressure, the migration period continued to bring many invaders into Central Europe, beginning with the Hunnic Empire. The Hunnic Empire was Attila the Hun 434–453, who later became a central figure in Hungarian mythology. After the disintegration of the Hunnic Empire, the Gepids, an Eastern Germanic tribe, who had been vassalized by the Huns, established their own kingdom in the Carpathian Basin. Other groups which reached the Carpathian Basin in the migration period were the Goths, Vandals, Lombards, and Slavs. In the 560s, the Avars founded the Avar Khaganate, a state that maintained supremacy in the region for more than 2 centuries. The Franks under Charlemagne defeated the Avars in a series of campaigns during the 790s. By the mid-9th century, the Balaton Principality, also known as Lower Pannonia, was established west of the Danube River as part of the Frankish March of Pannonia. The First Bulgarian Empire conquered the lands east of the Danube River and took over rule of the local Slavic tribes and remnants of the Avars. History. Before 895, the Roman Empire conquered the territory west of the Danube River between 35 and 9 BC. From 9 BC to the end of the 4th century AD, Pannonia, the western part of the Carpathian Basin, was part of the Roman Empire. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD under the stress of the migration of Germanic tribes and Carpathian pressure, the migration period continued to bring many invaders into Central Europe, beginning with the Hunnic Empire circa 370 to 469. The most powerful ruler of the Hunnic Empire was Attila the Hun 434 to 453, who later became a central figure in Hungarian mythology. After the disintegration of the Hunnic Empire, the Gepids, an Eastern Germanic tribe, who had been vassalized by the Huns, established their own kingdom in the Carpathian Basin. Other groups which reached the Carpathian Basin in the migration period were the Goths, Vandals, Lombards, and Slavs. In the 560s, the Avars founded the Avar Khaganate, a state that maintained supremacy in the region for more than 2 centuries. The Franks under Charlemagne defeated the Avars in a series of campaigns during the 790s. By the mid-9th century, the Balaton Principality, also known as Lower Pannonia, was established west of the Danube River as part of the Frankish March of Pannonia. The First Bulgarian Empire conquered the lands east of the Danube River and took over rule of the local Slavic tribes and remnants of the Avars. Medieval Hungary 895 to 1526. The freshly unified Hungarians led by Arpad, by tradition a descendant of Attila, settled in the Carpathian Basin starting in 895. According to the Finno-Ugrian theory, they originated from an ancient Uralic-speaking population that formerly inhabited the forested area between the Volga River and the Ural Mountains. As a federation of united tribes, Hungary was established in 895, some 50 years after the division of the Carolingian Empire at the Treaty of Verdun in 843, before the unification of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Initially, the rising Principality of Hungary, Western Turkey in medieval Greek sources, was a state created by a semi-nomadic people. It accomplished an enormous transformation into a Christian realm during the 10th century. This state was well functioning, and the nation's military power allowed the Hungarians to conduct successful fierce campaigns and raids, from Constantinople to as far as today's Spain. A later defeat at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 signaled a provisory end to most campaigns on foreign territories, at least towards the west. Age of Arpadian Kings. The year 972 marked the date when the ruling Prince Jesu of the Arpad dynasty officially started to integrate Hungary into the Christian Western Europe. His firstborn son, Saint Stephen I, became the first king of Hungary after defeating his pagan uncle Kopany, who also claimed the throne. Under Stephen, Hungary was recognized as a Catholic apostolic kingdom. Applying to Pope Sylvester II, Stephen received the insignia of royalty, including probably a part of the Holy Crown of Hungary, currently kept in the Hungarian parliament from the papacy. By 1006, Stephen consolidated his power, and started sweeping reforms to convert Hungary into a Western feudal state. The country switched to using the Latin language, and until as late as 1844, Latin remained the official language of Hungary. Around this time, Hungary began to become a powerful kingdom. Ladislaus I extended Hungary's frontier in Transylvania and invaded Croatia in 1091. The Croatian campaign culminated in the Battle of Gvozd Mountain in 1097 and a personal union of Croatia and Hungary in 1102, ruled by Kalaman I.e. Konives Kalman. The most powerful and wealthiest king of the Arpad dynasty was Bela III, who disposed of the equivalent of 23 tons of pure silver a year. This exceeded the income of the French king, estimated at 17 tons, and was double the receipts of the English crown. Andrew II issued the Diploma Andrianum, which secured the special privileges of the Transylvanian Saxons and is considered the first autonomy law in the world. He led the Fifth Crusade to the Holy Land in 1217, setting up the largest royal army in the history of crusades. His Golden Bull of 1222 was the first constitution in continental Europe. The lesser nobles also began to present Andrew with grievances, a practice that evolved into the institution of the Parlamentum Publicum. In 1241 to 1242, the kingdom received a major blow with the Mongol Tatar invasion. Up to half of Hungary's then population of 2 million were victims of the invasion. King Bela IV let Cumans and Jassic people into the country, who were fleeing the Mongols. Over the centuries, they were fully assimilated into the Hungarian population. As a consequence, after the Mongols retreated, King Bela ordered the construction of hundreds of stone castles and fortifications, to defend against a possible second Mongol invasion. The Mongols returned to Hungary in 1285, but the newly built stone castle systems and new tactics using a higher proportion of heavily armed knights stopped them. The invading Mongol force was defeated near Pest by the royal army of Ladislaus IV of Hungary. As with later invasions, it was repelled handily, the Mongols losing much of their invading force. Age of elected kings. The Kingdom of Hungary reached one of its greatest extents during the Arpadian kings, yet royal power was weakened at the end of their rule in 1301, after a destructive period of interregnum 1301 to 1308. The first Angevin king, Charles I of Hungary, a bilineal descendant of the Arpad dynasty, successfully restored royal power, and defeated oligarch rivals, the so-called Little Kings. The second Angevin Hungarian king, Louis the Great (1342–1382), led many successful military campaigns from Lithuania to southern Italy, Kingdom of Naples, and was also King of Poland from 1370. After King Louis died without a male heir, the country was stabilized only when Sigismund of Luxembourg (1387–1437) succeeded to the throne, who in 1433 also became Holy Roman Emperor. Sigismund was also in several ways a bilineal descendant of the Arpad dynasty. The first Hungarian Bible translation was completed in 1439. For half a year in 1437, there was an anti-feudal and anti-clerical peasant revolt in Transylvania, the Budinagental revolt, which was strongly influenced by Hussite ideas. From a small noble family in Transylvania, John Hunyadi grew to become one of the country's most powerful lords, thanks to his outstanding capabilities as a mercenary commander. He was elected governor then regent. He was a successful crusader against the Ottoman Turks, one of his greatest victories being the siege of Belgrade in 1456. The last strong king of medieval Hungary was the Renaissance king Matthias Corvinus (1458–1490), son of John Hunyadi. His election was the first time that a member of the nobility mounted to the Hungarian royal throne without dynastic background. He was a successful military leader and an enlightened patron of the arts and learning. His library, the Bibliotheca Corviniana, was Europe's greatest collection of historical chronicles, philosophic and scientific works in the 15th century, and second only in size to the Vatican Library. Items from the Bibliotheca Corviniana were inscribed on UNESCO's Memory of the World Register in 2005. The serfs and common people considered him a just ruler because he protected them from excessive demands from and other abuses by the magnates under his rule. In 1479, the Hungarian army destroyed the Ottoman and Wallachian troops at the Battle of Bredfield. Abroad he defeated the Polish and German imperial armies of Frederick at Breslau-Rock-Law. Matthias' mercenary standing army, the Black Army of Hungary, was an unusually large army for its time, and it conquered parts of Austria, Vienna 1485 and parts of Bohemia. Decline of Hungary 1490–1526. King Matthias died without lawful sons, and the Hungarian magnates procured the accession of the Pole Vladislaus II 1490–1516, supposedly because of his weak influence on Hungarian aristocracy. In 1514, the weakened old King Vladislaus II faced a major peasant rebellion led by Georgi Dozsa, which was ruthlessly crushed by the nobles, led by John Zaplier. The resulting degradation of order paved the way for Ottoman preeminence. In 1521, the strongest Hungarian fortress in the south, Nandorf today's Belgrade, Serbia, fell to the Turks. The early appearance of Protestantism further worsened internal relations in the country. Ottoman Wars 1526–1699. After some 150 years of wars with the Hungarians and other states, the Ottomans gained a decisive victory over the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, where King Louis II died while fleeing. Amid political chaos, the divided Hungarian nobility elected two kings simultaneously, John Zapolyar and Ferdinand I of the Habsburg dynasty. With the conquest of Buda by the Turks in 1541, Hungary was divided into three parts and remained so until the end of the 17th century. The northwestern part, termed as Royal Hungary, was annexed by the Habsburgs, who ruled as kings of Hungary. The eastern part of the kingdom became independent as the Principality of Transylvania, under Ottoman and later Habsburg suzerainty. The remaining central area, including the capital Buda, was known as the Pashalik of Buda. The vast majority of the 17,000 and 19,000 Ottoman soldiers in service in the Ottoman fortresses in the territory of Hungary were Orthodox and Muslim Balkan Slavs rather than ethnic Turkish people. Orthodox southern Slavs were also acting as Akinjus and other light troops intended for pillaging in the territory of present-day Hungary. In 1686, the Holy League's army, containing over 74,000 men from various nations, reconquered Buda from the Turks. After some more crushing defeats of the Ottomans in the next few years, the entire Kingdom of Hungary was removed from Ottoman rule by 1718. The last trade into Hungary by the Ottoman vassals Tatars from Crimea took place in 1717. The constrained Habsburg counter-reformation efforts in the 17th century reconverted the majority of the kingdom to Catholicism. The ethnic composition of Hungary was fundamentally changed as a consequence of the prolonged warfare with the Turks. A large part of the country became devastated, population growth was stunted, and many smaller settlements perished. The Austrian Habsburg government settled large groups of Serbs and other Slavs in the depopulated south, and settled Germans called Danube Swabians in various areas, but Hungarians were not allowed to settle or resettle in the south of the Great Plain. From the 18th century to World War I between 1703 and 1711. There was a large-scale uprising led by Francis II Rákóczi, who after the dethronement of the Habsburgs in 1707 at the Diet of Onod, took power provisionally as the ruling prince of Hungary for the wartime period, but refused the Hungarian crown and the title king. The uprisings lasted for years. The Hungarian Kirjuk army, although taking over most of the country, lost the main battle at Trencs in 1708. 3 years later, because of the growing desertion, defeatism and low morale, the Kirjuk forces finally surrendered. During the Napoleonic Wars and afterwards, the Hungarian Diet had not convened for decades. In the 1820s, the emperor was forced to convene the Diet, which marked the beginning of a reform period 1825 to 1848. Countess von Széchenyi, one of the most prominent statesmen of the country, recognized the urgent need of modernization and his message got through. The Hungarian parliament was reconvened in 1825 to handle financial needs. A liberal party emerged and focused on providing for the peasantry. Lajos Kossuth, a famous journalist at that time, emerged as leader of the lower gentry in the parliament. A remarkable upswing started as the nation concentrated its forces on modernization even though the Habsburg monarchs obstructed all important liberal laws relating to civil and political rights and economic reforms. Many reformers Lajos Kossuth, Mihaly Dancsics were imprisoned by the authorities. On the 15th of March 1848, mass demonstrations in Pest and Buda enabled Hungarian reformists to push through a list of 12 demands. Under Governor and President Lajos Kossuth and the first Prime Minister, Lajos Batthyány, the House of Habsburg was dethroned. The Habsburg ruler and his advisors skillfully manipulated the Croatian, Serbian and Romanian peasantry, led by priests and officers firmly loyal to the Habsburgs, and induced them to rebel against the Hungarian government, though the Hungarians were supported by the vast majority of the Slovak, German and Rus nationalities and by all the Jews of the kingdom, as well as by a large number of Polish, Austrian and Italian volunteers. In July 1849 the Hungarian parliament proclaimed and enacted the first laws of ethnic and minority rights in the world. Many members of the nationalities gained the coveted highest positions within the Hungarian army, like General Janos Damjanic, an ethnic Serb who became a Hungarian national hero through his command of the 3rd Hungarian Army Corps, or Joseph Bum, who was Polish and also became a national hero in Hungary. The Hungarian forces Honvédség defeated Austrian armies. To counter the successes of the Hungarian Revolutionary Army, Habsburg Emperor Franz Joseph I asked for help from the gendarme of Europe, Tsar Nicholas I, whose Russian armies invaded Hungary. This made Artur Gorgi surrender in August 1849. The leader of the Austrian army, Julius Jacob von Hainaut, became governor of Hungary for a few months, and ordered the execution of the 13 martyrs of Arad, leaders of the Hungarian army, and Prime Minister Batthyány in October 1849. Lajos Kossuth escaped into exile. Following the War of 18,481,849, the whole country was in passive resistance. Because of external and internal problems, reforms seemed inevitable and major military defeats of Austria forced the Habsburgs to negotiate the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, by which the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary was formed. This empire had the second largest area in Europe after the Russian Empire, and it was the third most populous after Russia and the German Empire. The two realms were governed separately by two parliaments from two capital cities, with a common monarch and common external and military policies. Economically, the empire was a customs union. The old Hungarian constitution was restored, and Franz Joseph I was crowned as King of Hungary. The era witnessed impressive economic development. The formerly backward Hungarian economy became relatively modern and industrialized by the turn of the 20th century, although agriculture remained dominant until 1890. In 1873, the old capital Buda and Buda were officially united with Pest, thus creating the new metropolis of Budapest. Many of the state institutions and the modern administrative system of Hungary were established during this period. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza and his cabinet tried to avoid the outbreak and escalating of a war in Europe, but their diplomatic efforts were unsuccessful. Austria-Hungary drafted 9 million fighting forces, 8 million soldiers in World War I, over 4 million from the Kingdom of Hungary on the side of Germany, Bulgaria, and Turkey. The troops raised in the Kingdom of Hungary spent little time defending the actual territory of Hungary, with the exceptions of the Brusilov offensive in June 1916, and a few months later, when the Romanian army made an attack into Transylvania, both of which were repelled. In comparison, of the total army, Hungary's loss ratio was more than any other nations of Austria-Hungary. The Central Powers conquered Serbia. Romania declared war. The Central Powers conquered southern Romania and the Romanian capital Bucharest. In 1916 Emperor Franz Joseph died, and the new monarch Charles IV sympathized with the pacifists. With great difficulty, the Central Powers stopped and repelled the attacks of the Russian Empire. The eastern front of the Allied Entente powers completely collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire then withdrew from all defeated countries. On the Italian front, the Austro-Hungarian army made no progress against Italy after January 1918. Despite great eastern successes, Germany suffered complete defeat on the more important Western Front. By 1918, the economic situation had deteriorated. Strikes in factories were organized by leftist and pacifist movements, and uprisings in the army had become commonplace. In the capital cities, the Austrian and Hungarian leftist liberal movements, the Maverick parties and their leaders, supported the separatism of ethnic minorities. Austria-Hungary signed a general armistice in Padua on 3 November 1918. In October 1918, Hungary's union with Austria was dissolved. Between the World Wars 1918 to 1941, following the First World War, Hungary underwent a period of profound political upheaval, beginning with the Asta Revolution in 1918, which brought the Social Democratic Mihaly Károlyi to power as prime minister. The Hungarian Royal Honved Army still had more than 1,400,000 soldiers when Mihaly Károlyi was announced as Prime Minister of Hungary. Károlyi yielded to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's demand for pacifism by ordering the disarmament of the Hungarian army. This happened under the direction of Béla Linde, Minister of War in the Károlyi government. Due to the full disarmament of its army, Hungary was to remain without a national defense at a time of particular vulnerability. During the rule of Károlyi's pacifist cabinet, Hungary lost the control over approximately 75% of its former pre-World War I territories, 325 plus 411 square kilometer without fight, and was subject to foreign occupation. The Little Entente, sensing an opportunity, invaded the country from three sides. Romania invaded Transylvania, Czechoslovakia annexed Upper Hungary, today's Slovakia, and a joint Serb-French coalition annexed Vojvodina and other southern regions. In March 1919, communists led by Bela Kun ousted the Karolyi government and proclaimed the Hungarian Soviet Republic Danex Kostalsasag, followed by a thorough Red Terror campaign. Despite some successes on the Czechoslovak front, Kun's forces were ultimately unable to resist the Romanian invasion. By August 1919, Romanian troops occupied Budapest and ousted Kun. In November 1919, rightist forces led by former Austro-Hungarian Admiral Miklós Horthy entered Budapest, exhausted by the war and its aftermath. The populace accepted Horthy's leadership. In January 1920, parliamentary elections were held and Horthy was proclaimed regent of the re-established Kingdom of Hungary, inaugurating the so-called Horthy-era Horthy Corps. The new government worked quickly to normalize foreign relations while turning a blind eye to a white terror that swept through the countryside. Extrajudicial killings of suspected communists and Jews lasted well into 1920. On the 4th of June of that year, the Treaty of Trianon established new borders for Hungary. The country lost 71% of its territory and 66% of its antebellum population, as well as many sources of raw materials and its sole port, Fiume. Though the revision of the treaty quickly rose to the top of the national political agenda, the Horthy government was not willing to resort to military intervention to do so. The initial years of the Horthy regime were preoccupied by putsch attempts by Charles IV, the Austro-Hungarian pretender, continued suppression of communists, and a migration crisis triggered by the Trianon territorial changes. Though free elections continued, Horthy's personality, and those of his personally selected prime ministers, dominated the political scene. The government's actions continued to drift right with the passage of anti-Semitic laws and, due to the continued isolation of the Little Entente, economic and then political gravitation toward Italy and Germany, the Great Depression further exacerbated the situation and the popularity of fascist politicians such as Gyula Gombos and Ferenc Szalasi, promising economic and social recovery, rose. Horthy's nationalist agenda reached its apogee in 1938 and 1940, when the Nazis rewarded Hungary's staunchly pro-Germany foreign policy in the First and Second Vienna Awards, respectively, peacefully restoring ethnic Hungarian majority areas lost after Trianon. In 1939, Hungary regained further territory from Czechoslovakia through force. Hungary formally joined the Axis powers on the 20th of November 1940, and in 1941, participated in the invasion of Yugoslavia, gaining some of its former territories in the south. World War II 1941 to 1945. Hungary formally entered World War II as an Axis power on the 26th of June 1941, declaring war on the Soviet Union after unidentified planes bombed Kassa, Munkacs, and Rahov. Hungarian troops fought on the Eastern Front for 2 years. Despite some early successes, the Hungarian government began seeking a secret peace pact with the Allies after the Second Army suffered catastrophic losses at the River Don in January 1943. Learning of the planned defection, German troops occupied Hungary on the 19th of March 1944 to guarantee Horthy's compliance. In October, as the Soviet front approached and the Hungarian government made further efforts to disengage from the war, German troops ousted Horthy and installed a puppet government under Szalasi's fascist Arrow Cross Party. During the German occupation in May to June 1944, the Arrow Cross and Hungarian police deported nearly 440,000 Jews, mainly to Auschwitz. Nearly all of them were murdered. The Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg managed to save a considerable number of Hungarian Jews by giving them Swedish passports. Rezső Kastner, one of the leaders of the Hungarian Aid and Rescue Committee, bribed senior SS officers such as Adolf Eichmann to allow some Jews to escape. The Horthy government's complicity in the Holocaust remains a point of controversy and contention. The war left Hungary devastated, destroying over 60% of the economy and causing significant loss of life. In addition to the over 600,000 Hungarian Jews killed, As many as 280,000 other Hungarians were raped, murdered and executed or deported for slave labor by Czechoslovaks, Soviet Red Army troops, and Yugoslavs. On the 13th of February 1945, Budapest surrendered. By April, German troops left the country under Soviet military occupation. 200,000 Hungarians were expelled from Czechoslovakia in exchange for 70,000 Slovaks living in Hungary. 202,000 ethnic Germans were expelled to Germany, and through the 1947 Paris peace treaties, Hungary was again reduced to its immediate post-Trianon borders. Communism 1945 to 1989. Following the defeat of Nazi Germany, Hungary became a satellite state of the Soviet Union. The Soviet leadership selected Matyas Rákosi to front the Stalinization of the country, and Rákosi de facto ruled Hungary from 1949 to 1956. His government's policies of militarization, industrialization, collectivization, and war compensation led to a severe decline in living standards. In imitation of Stalin's KGB, the Rákosi government established a secret political police, the OV, to enforce the new regime. In the ensuing purges, approximately 350,000 officials and intellectuals were imprisoned or executed from 1948 to 1956. Many freethinkers, Democrats, and Horthy-era dignitaries were secretly arrested and extrajudicially interned in domestic and foreign gulags. Some 600,000 Hungarians were deported to Soviet labor camps, where at least 200,000 died. After Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union pursued a program of de-Stalinization that was inimical to Rákosi, leading to his deposition. The following political cooling saw the ascent of Nagy to the premiership, and the growing interest of students and intellectuals in political life. Nagy promised market liberalization and political openness, while Rákosi opposed both vigorously. Rákosi eventually managed to discredit Nagy and replace him with the more hardline Erno Gyro. Hungary joined the Warsaw Pact in May 1955, as societal dissatisfaction with the regime swelled, following the firing on peaceful demonstrations by Soviet soldiers and secret police, and rallies throughout the country. On the 23rd of October 1956, protesters took to the streets in Budapest, initiating the 1956 revolution. In an effort to quell the chaos, Nagy returned as premier, promised free elections, and took Hungary out of the Warsaw Pact. The violence nonetheless continued as revolutionary militias sprung up against the Soviet army and the OV. The roughly 3,000-strong resistance fought Soviet tanks using Molotov cocktails and machine pistols. Though the preponderance of the Soviets was immense, they suffered heavy losses, and by the 30th of October 1956 most Soviet troops had withdrawn from Budapest to garrison the countryside. For a time, the Soviet leadership was unsure how to respond to developments in Hungary, but eventually decided to intervene to prevent a destabilization of the Soviet bloc. On the 4th of November, reinforcements of more than 150,000 troops and 2,500 tanks entered the country from the Soviet Union. Nearly 20,000 Hungarians were killed resisting the intervention, while an additional 21,600 were imprisoned afterwards for political reasons. Some 13,000 were interned and 230 brought to trial and executed. Nagy was secretly tried, found guilty, sentenced to death and executed by hanging in June 1958. Because borders were briefly opened, nearly 250,000 people fled the country by the time the revolution was suppressed. Kadar era 1956 to 1988. After a second, briefer period of Soviet military occupation, János Kadar, Nagy's former Minister of State, was chosen by the Soviet leadership to head the new government and chair the new ruling Socialist Workers' Party MSZMP. Kadar quickly normalized the situation. In 1963, the government granted a general amnesty and released the majority of those imprisoned for their active participation in the uprising. Kadar proclaimed a new policy line, according to which the people were no longer compelled to profess loyalty to the party if they tacitly accepted the socialist regime as a fact of life. In many speeches, he described this as Those who are not against us are with us. Kadar introduced new planning priorities in the economy, such as allowing farmers significant plots of private land within the collective farm system Hastaji Gazalkodas. The living standard rose as consumer good and food production took precedence over military production, which was reduced to 1/10 of pre-revolutionary levels in 1968. The new economic mechanism introduced free market elements into socialist command economy. From the 1960s through the late 1980s, Hungary was often referred to as the happiest baroque within the Eastern Bloc. During the latter part of the Cold War, Hungary's GDP per capita was fourth only to East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union itself. As a result of this relatively high standard of living, a more liberalized economy, a less censored press, and less restricted travel rights, Hungary was generally considered one of the more liberal countries in which to live in Central Europe during communism. In the 1980s, however, living standards steeply declined again due to a worldwide recession to which communism was unable to respond. By the time Kadar died in 1989, the Soviet Union was in steep decline and a younger generation of reformists saw liberalization as the solution to economic and social issues. Third Republic 1989. Present Hungary's transition from communism to democracy and capitalism. Rendszer regime change was peaceful and prompted by economic stagnation, domestic political pressure, and changing relations with other Warsaw Pact countries. Although the MSZMP began round-table talks with various opposition groups in March 1989, the reburial of Imanagi as a revolutionary martyr that June is widely considered the symbolic end of communism in Hungary. Over 100,000 people attended the Budapest ceremony without any significant government interference, and many speakers openly called for Soviet troops to leave the country. Free elections were held in May 1990, and the Hungarian Democratic Forum, a major conservative opposition group, was elected to the head of a coalition government. Joseph Antol became the first democratically elected prime minister since World War II. With the removal of state subsidies and rapid privatization in 1991, Hungary was affected by a severe economic recession. The Antol government's austerity measures proved unpopular, and the Communist Party's legal and political heir, the Socialist Party, won the subsequent 1994 elections. This abrupt shift in the political landscape was repeated in 1998 and 2002. Each electoral cycle, the governing party was ousted and the erstwhile opposition elected. Like most other post-communist European states, however, Hungary broadly pursued an integrationist agenda, joining NATO in 1999 and the European Union in 2004. As a NATO member, Hungary was involved in the Yugoslav wars. In 2006, major protests erupted after it was revealed that Prime Minister Ferenc Gyurcsány had claimed in a private speech that his party lied to win the recent elections. The popularity of left-wing parties plummeted in the ensuing political upheaval, and in 2010, Viktor Orbán's National Conservative Fidesz was elected to a parliamentary supermajority. The legislature consequently approved a new constitution, among other sweeping governmental and legal changes. Although these developments were met with and still engender controversy, Fidesz secured a second parliamentary supermajority in 2014 and a third in 2018. In September 2018, the European Parliament voted to act against Hungary, under the terms of Article 7 of the Treaty on European Union. Proponents of the vote claimed that the Hungarian government posed a systematic threat to democracy and the rule of law. The vote was carried with the support of 448 MEPs, narrowly clearing the two-thirds majority required. The vote marked the first the European Parliament had triggered an Article 7 procedure against an EU member state. Péter Szijjártó, the Hungarian foreign minister, described the vote as petty revenge which had been provoked by Hungary's tough anti-migration policies. Szijjártó alleged that the vote was fraudulent because abstentions were not counted, which made it easier to reach the two-thirds majority required to pass the vote. At the European elections in May 2019, Viktor Orbán's Fidesz party secured another sweeping victory. receiving more than 50% of the votes. In March 2020, during the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, the Hungarian parliament passed a law granting the government the power to rule by decree to the extent it is necessary to diminish the consequences of the pandemic, suspending